And first of all, I'd like to also welcome all of you here. I think that the MEF is a great opportunity for people, if you will, to reach across the aisle. We have beef producers here, pork producers, of course, corn, soybeans, agribusiness, farm organizations. There's an amalgam of everybody in the industry who has an interest in international and interest in exporting, and coming together here to really make a better world for us and actually better industries for us here domestically. I think that also when I want to welcome people, I'd also like to welcome our international directors who've come from quite a far distance to be here with you today. They're very much interested in sharing their experiences, their outlooks, what they see in these markets. As I said, this is a strategic planning conference, so this is your conference to have input and to interact with our membership and with our leadership and with our overseas directors. I'd also like to thank the international guests as well. I can see some faces here that are international guests who's also present here. And I think also, of course, we have, I can see some familiar faces from the USDA and from the USTR here. We very much appreciate the cooperative relationship we enjoy with you. We don't always agree on everything, but for the most part, we are a U.S. team. And this U.S. team, I think, is still very, very effective. And I still am very, very proud to be a Yankee trader, if you will, when it comes to selling U.S. meat across the globe. I think Mark has aptly really conveyed and covered the landscape with his overview of the successes and challenges that we face and that befall the U.S. Red meat industry. I would have to say, as Mark remarks about the time that's elapsed, as you say, I think it's more challenging now than it ever was as far as selling meat, exporting meat internationally. It seems like engaging with our trading partners, and especially the governments of our trading partners, I don't remember when it's been easy, but I don't remember when it's been this difficult. So if that makes anybody feel any better, I really doubt it, but that's really what we're dealing with. But in spite of all this, and it's really a credit to all of you that when we look at Erin's numbers that she'll have prepared here for the remainder of the year, that we're looking at basically $13 billion in exports. And if you consider that last slide that Mark showed with all the challenges we have with Russia, with China, with a lot of issues, I don't like to give the journalists any more ammunition to write, if you will, about a lot of these things. It's really an accomplishment. It's really an industry accomplishment. And you all should really, in a way, give yourselves a hand for the excellent performance that you folks have done. I think when I talk about the MEF Strategic Planning Conference, it's really, as valued members of the USMEF, I think I'd really like to stress, this is your opportunity to express your opinions, your suggestions about the beef, pork, and lamb and processed meats industries, and the strategic directions that we're trying to go forward with in the markets. The USMEF has carefully crafted these SMPs. These are the strategic marketing profiles that you should have all read before you've come to this meeting. And USMEF international directors, the vice presidents, and leadership are here today. And throughout this meeting, you will have the opportunity to address them with your concerns, with your questions, observations relative to the international markets. I mean, we really want to hear from you, our stakeholders. And I think Steve Isef, who a lot of you remember very well, sometimes people refer to him as Spearman, but he was a man with a spear here a few years ago. But he talked about alignment in the industry and how we can only be effective. And I think his speech really resonates, actually, when we look at the issues we're facing today. Because if we are united, if we are aligned, there's no doubt we can accomplish much more united than we can divided. And that's really the spirit of the Meat Export Federation. So Steve, it's a great thought you left us with. And I think, the international marketplace has probably never been more important to the industry. If you take a look at the fact that just from 2007 to 2013, in the United States, total U.S. meat consumption dropped 7.8%. And with 96% of the world's population outside the United States, I think the future for this industry and the viability of this industry is definitely in trade. What we have here, of course, is the USMEF office locations. And I think as you look at these offices, of course, you can see all these capitals of all these countries. But I think more important than this, when you look at this, you know, we have people in these offices, positioned in these offices, but they all are different types of complexions as far as their skill set. We have some people, for example, that basically, when you look at it, they speak over 20 languages. If you look at it within the MEF, so every day, something about U.S. beef, pork, or lamb is being communicated in roughly 20 languages. I think we have in-country experts basically who know the cultures, they know the customs, they know the food cultures in these countries, and they understand, most importantly, how business is conducted. I think when we look at the skill set of some of these staffs and some of the heads of these people, of these offices, you'll see, for example, people like Joel Haggard. He's a former alumni of FAS. He had a very good career, a short career at FAS, because we hired him very quickly, knowing the skill set that Joel has. But as we go down and we look at these people, we have people who have skills in butchery, if you will. We have people who are economists. We have people who are basically chefs. We have retail experts. We have food service experts. So we have a lot of people who have a lot of exposure to advertising, to public relations. So positioning our industry, whatever it takes in these markets to afford our industry the best face that we can put on it, that's what our people are doing. I think the other thing is that when we look at this, and as I look at Joel and I look at some of the overseas directors, you know, we have history. You know, we've been in these markets for numbers of years, and a lot of us grew up in these markets, if you will, so we really have a historical perspective. And when you're there at the beginning of this thing, when you have that historical perspective, I think that's very significant, because if you know where you've been, you can kind of tell where you're going. And I think this is very, very important. So I think some of our overseas directors are some of the best people at predicting behavior and predicting outcomes, basically, for the areas that we work in. And so I guess if you look at this 40 years of MEF for 38 years, we've represented the entire value chain from the United States. And from production to processing, all the way to the plates and bowls around the world. And the USMEF staff, if you will, they're basically working at this 24/7. When we're sleeping, there's someone in the world working on moving U.S. beef, U.S. pork, or U.S. lamb. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, because of the mosaic that is the world, is trying to convey truth in the market, because we think that's the most important service that we can provide you people who make business decisions, is that we try to be as truthful and honest about what we see in the markets. And then that is something I think that we continually try to work on. But I think but conveying the reality of these markets is really one of the key things. And so we come to this meeting prepared to talk in depth about these markets, the dynamics in these markets, the change that's going on in these markets. Is the change basically augured by internal dynamics, by external dynamics? There's a lot of things that go on in the international markets. And also if you look at the different segments and sectors in the market. So it gets to be very, very complex and very complicated, but I like to think that our directors have a very good skill set when it comes to explaining this. And I think we all know people who are experts. I mean, I've met a lot of people over the years that would come visit us in an overseas market. They're an automatic expert. They've been to the market once, or they've read a book about it. We all deal with these kinds of people. And because Mark's from Nebraska, I always think of Mark and football in Nebraska, and you know, it's an aspiring team. It's a very good team. But if you take a person, and this is the challenge that some of our directors have, and some of us all have, is who really has the facts, who really does bear the truth. So if you go to that stadium and you go up to, let's say, maybe 90 rows in the stadium, I think there's 90 rows there probably. If you go up 90 rows and you have someone with a still shot camera, and they take a picture of the football, it's game day, it's on a Saturday, they take one shot, it's a still shot. In a way, that does give you the picture, but just think if you were down on the field and you were playing offense, you got the defense down there, you got the offense down there, and each week you're basically preparing for a different opponent, and you're basically looking at game plans. And I think this is where I'm at, is that with our overseas directors, they're the ones that are down on the field. They see the action, they're right in the action. And the people that are down on the field have a whole different perspective when you're getting your you-know-what kicked even at Nebraska, than the guy that's 90 rows up in the stands. And so I think this is really something that we really have to think about when we think about what USMEF brings to the industry. I'd also like to indicate that I'm very proud of our domestic staff. When you start to take a look, frankly, at some of the work that these people do, we were doing a survey basically for another agency that is taking a look at us, but we discovered that basically just in technical services, they answer over 4,400 calls or have communications basically on technical issues with our packers, with the government, with many, many people. I would venture that Thad and Aaron, with their policy and their analysis and the things they do, they're probably right at that same level as well. I think when it comes to like our marketing and communications, we have seen over 400 different articles and papers and analysis and research projects have been put out by the marketing department. And I would say the communications department is probably in that same area as well. So when you start to take a look at what we're doing to try to communicate, I know we can always do it better, but like Mark says, you don't have to get sick to get better. I think it's very important when we take a look at this. But getting back to this strategic planning, I would like to kind of move on to a grid here that basically shows basically this is our planning process, and we have on the top line here, you can see basically we have the checkoff programs, and we kind of combine with beef and pork and lamb, of course, and all the checkoffs that we deal with. We deal with state corn checkoffs and soybeans, but there's a lot of occasions here where you can see these red lines where these are formal occasions where we get together, mainly staff, with the organizations that are funding us. And what we're basically saying is all year long, basically, we're looking at interaction with checkoff groups and with these groups. Down below, this is with the UES, this would be with FAS, the US government. We're in contact with the USDA on a daily basis, but simply, I think this also shows that there's a very dedicated process for us for communications, for development of plans, sharing of information, and this type of thing as we go forward. So in a way, we work with our overseas directors very, very closely, but we work with all of you in this whole process of developing going forward in these markets. I think the next slide basically I think is you're very familiar with, because this is a slide that, if you've seen John Hinners, who you probably all see probably too frequently, but you do see John. John's a great guy and does a great job and very passionate for this organization. But Dan and Greg, all of us, they'll show you this slide. And this slide is very important because this is what we call our MEF TQM approach. And this is the predicate for the thinking that we use when we go into a market. And first of all, if you go to a market, you engage in a market, and this is what I did when I was much younger in Asia, for example. You would go into a market and you would try to first meet importers, because the importers would know a little bit about the distribution, et cetera. And these importers, distributors were very important because they would have something to do with cold storage. We're bringing in a product that needs to be chilled or refrigerated, or frozen, so this is very, very important. And then as you work with these distributors and these importers, and there's a progression into this thing, you work further into the HRI market. And a lot of places we would first get our beef into, for example, and our pork into initially would be hotels, because the hotels usually had international chefs. These were people that were familiar with our product. They'd maybe been in Europe, or they'd been in Canada or some different place. A lot of them were Swiss, a lot of them were German. You met a lot of these chefs all over the world, and they would go from different country to different country. So we started to develop a network, and from this network we could introduce, beef maybe in the evening. We could have pork and Canadian bacon, which has always been kind of interesting to explain. You'd have Canadian bacon in the morning, you'd have bacon in the morning, you'd have ham. We'd do these types of things. But this was this natural progression. And then as we get into a sector, we continue to keep drilling down. So you would go from the white tablecloth to the hotel. You can see the family style, the fast food, the institutional, and you just keep drilling down. And each one of those is a separate strategy. Each one of those is a different set of probably products, product mix, this type of thing. So this is this developmental thing, and this is what I always talk about when I talk about frankly, markets within markets. We sometimes think of just marketing to Japan or marketing to Korea or marketing to Mexico. It's much, much more complex. And so when someone says, well, we think, you have too much money in this market, maybe you should pull back, the question first comes, well, where do you want to pull back? where do you want to pull back? Because this is really how we're confronting with this, and this is how our directors frankly look at these markets in these very much particles, if you will. And then the same thing plays out in retail. You'll work to get something, maybe even bring a retailer into a hotel and serve him some product. He eats the product, you ask him to come to the States. I mean, all this is this developmental work that we've been doing for the last 38 years. And then finally, you get down to the consumer. When you start having your product grilled through the channel, as it's becoming more and more manifest in the channel, then it's time for you to start doing consumer activities. And I remember 30 years ago when we first got our T funding, which was the predecessor to the MAP funding, some people would run right out, start advertising, taking out ads in newspapers, but they didn't have anything done in the channel. So the consumers could see an ad, but they didn't know where to find the product. So this goes back a long ways, but this has really been the model that we use when we take a look at this. I think another area that when we look at markets, and I'm going to talk about this very simply, is what I call, there's really 3 Ds. There's 3 key principles that we have when we develop a market. And number 1 is there is market development. And we consider this very, very key. In that last grid that I showed you, this is the predecessor of it. This was copyrighted by the USMEF in 1993. Now, I think it's very difficult for you to see this, but this was a TQM, a total quality marketing approach, based on Deming, who was a guy that was in Japan many, many years ago. And it's taking the guesswork out of marketing. And usually in marketing, a lot of people say, well, I think it's going to be this, or it should be like this. I mean, I have a hunch that's going to be this way. Well, we don't do that at MEF. If you have a hunch, you don't have enough information. So you go back to the customer and you find out. There is no hunch and guess in marketing, not with us. If you know the customer, if you're talking to the customer, you will find out the information. But at the end of the day, you go back to the customer. So we started this whole process called ICC, Intensified Customer Contact. And wherever we go out into these markets, we're always meeting the customer. And why do we do that? Because Roel Andreessen, Mark Gustafson, Steve Isif, they go talk to these customers. And we want to be talking to the same people they're talking to. And when those guys come to the markets and they say, hey, can you introduce us to somebody? We got to know who they are. So this is really the way we work in the market. It's very channel specific, and it's a grid like this. And the thing about this is, in every one of these areas, you can see we start out with information gathering. You first have to gather the information. So this is one of the things our directors do when they go into a market. The next thing they would do is you'd have your entry-level activities. Then you have what you call your expansion activities. And this is over a period of time, obviously. This is not in 1 year. And then you have your maintenance activities where we kind of pull back, and the exporter or the packer or whatever, they work into this much, much more closely. And you can see we set basic goals. We have we have trade activities, we have consumer activities, but you can notice here there's no consumer activities until we have the channel filled out. We have research, and then we have a forecast, basically a budget versus actual, and we have actual tonnage that we identify with this. So this has really been I would say the cornerstone of that prior grid, the simplified grid that Greg and Dan and John show you, and this is something that is in our DNA as far as approaching the markets, and I think it's served us very, very well. So I think when we start looking at this, we'll use this as we go into markets. For example, like in Africa, we have a big GBI initiative going on in Africa. We're working with the U.S. Poultry and Egg Council. We do work with others in order to maximize expenses and to save money and to gather information. We're using this in South America. We're using this, of course, in Asia. So this whole model works. So the market development thing works very well. I would say the second principle that we work on, so one is market development. The second principle that we actually work on is what we call displacement. And, long before I came to the Meat Export Federation, I did work for a Japanese company, and I was a regional sales manager. And one of the things, there's only so much you can sell to somebody that's new. But what you find out, you have a lot of people that have your competitors' products. And so when you're trying to sell in a market, one of the best things you can do is try to displace your competition. And so one of the things we really look at, because if you look at the world, there's roughly 190 countries, 195 countries in the world, And about 100 of them really are eligible to buy our product. I mean, they have you have to look at countries when you get in this, what's their credit worthiness, what's their cold chain for meat. I mean, if you're going to unload it on the dust, and there's not even a paved road. I mean, these are hard people to sell our high quality products to, pork, beef, or lamb. So you got to take a look at this. So the world gets smaller. And as the world gets smaller, and then you have these aggressive forecasts by these producer groups, aggressive forecasts by the packers. They let us know this is what we're after, this is what we're trying to do. You look for market development, but you equally look for market displacement. And so to displace the competition means there's already a cold chain. If the competition is there, that means they already have credit worthiness. These are all things that are very important to traders and people that are going into these markets. So these are things that we take a look at as we look at displacing these people. And I think when we look at market displacement, there's a very good example of this, where we've been displaced in the market. Like with BSE, we were kicked out of these markets. We were kicked out of roughly 70 markets 12 years ago. And we've worked we maybe have 3 or 4 left that we have to get back into, if you will. But once we got back into those markets, we basically were displacing our competition. So to me, that is very, very key. The third pillar of our marketing approach, basically, and I think it's important for us to talk about this because people sometimes question what we do or how we do it, but we really got to defend the markets. When we're in Mexico today, we have 90% market share, roughly, of pork and beef in that market. This becomes, if you're going to try to develop even further, how much is it going to take, or how much do you defend, And so we really work very, very hard at defending the share that we've gained. I think that, again, with BSE, for example, it's very clear with BSE that the fact that we were working in these markets after we were out of these markets, and the fact that we could continue to talk about our safety, our beef quality assurance, and these types of things, when we did get back into the markets, it was very, very advantageous to us, and we got back very, very quickly. And on this one, I'd like to talk a little bit about defending our markets in the way of pork and our strategy of pork basically in Asia. And since we all know about the cessation of trade that we've had with Russia, and we know about our relationship with Russia, and then over the course of the last year, it's been living hell trying to deal with the Russians from our government, from every standpoint. But I think all of us have been talking about how aggressive the EU is. They were selling roughly 500,000 to 600,000 metric tons of pork to Russia. That was cut off. And we knew the Europeans were going to look at North Asia first, because Asia, or all over Asia, if you will, is a big consumption area of pork. And we talked about this oncoming tsunami, if you will, of pork coming into Asia. And I think if you take a look at this, you can see 2013, you can see here basically that the Asia total, and you can see 2013 for the United States, and you can see 2013 the Asia total for the EU. And then you start looking at these increases based in 2014. We've stayed very comparable, very, very almost the same, a little less actually, and this is just January through August. But then take a look how basically how much the EU has gained in Japan, how much they've gained in China, how much they've gained in South Korea, Hong Kong, and it goes on and on and on, basically the Philippines. So maybe we look at the statistics and we say, oh, we're up 10%, we're up 15% in this market, we're doing pretty well. And actually Japan is beguiling because they had PEDV and they lost 5% of their herd. So they had to import more. We exported more, but they exported almost 3 times as much from the EU as they're doing from us. So I would say, as we take a look at this, this is something that is giving us pause. It's giving us reason to be alarmed because it's not just in one country, it's the EU. And I think exports from the EU are about level from where they were. They didn't lose anything, frankly, after they lost the Russian market. So this is something I think that's very concerning. I think the other thing is, as you look at the economic situation worldwide, the EU right now, John Brooks said earlier, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but there's a possibility we'll have parity with the euro. And right now, the euro's been devalued by 8%, and the US dollar has gone up by 8%. And in other words, as the clock ticks, we're getting less and less competitive. And according to John, the real tsunami, if you will, the second wave, which is always a bad wave, is just coming now as we talk in August. So I think I would encourage the Pork Committee, I would encourage everybody to really take a look at this, really talk to our directors, because we see this when I talk about defending the markets. We really have to be defensive when it comes to what the EU is doing. And this is a slide from Joel Haggard. I mean, to me, it's as clear as clear can be. I guess also with this meeting, you know, when we talk about strategic planning, I think we're always looking for direction from our membership. And I think one of the key areas that we have where we can actually see what our membership wants us to do is through the resolution process. And I think every year we see resolutions that are passed in both the spring and the fall meeting. And these resolutions, to me, are probably the guideposts for the organization. The organization, the membership, you are basically, and most of these have all been passed unanimously. So this is what you're saying. We want staff, we want the leadership, the exec committee, the officers. This is what's really important to us. And these resolutions, they range from market access. There's been a lot of resolutions having to do with, of course, with BSE, getting more information, doing what we can do, working with the government to provide more information so we can be more accessible, if you will, in these international markets, doing a lot on science-based standards. So in a lot of our communications internationally, when we're talking about in our communications, we have a lot of organs, if you will, that we go out to the trade, to consumers, to a lot of people. There's a different message depending who you're talking to, but we really talk about science-based standards. We see this as very, very, very important. I think you're all seeing something that we worked on that we've put up close to $200,000 in our budget for is this thing called product stewardship. This is a new committee. But it's a new committee that we basically believe is very important. As you know, we've had many interruptions to our trade. It could be PRTs, pathogen reduction treatments. There's many things that can crop up to impede your flow into the market. So what this really is a vehicle for communication across the breadth of the industry, from the producers to the processors to what they use in the processing to the pharma companies. So we can communicate, so we have and hopefully have and obviate less interruptions to trade. There's a lot to do with marketing. There's a resolution basically on lamb access that we're working on. We're very proud that the USDA has latched onto that. There's been a team from Taiwan that's come looking at access from Taiwan, animal health issues, traceability. So there's a plethora of things that the organization has been asked to do through this resolutions process. And I rarely talk about this in this forum, but I do want you to know that we do take all these resolutions very, very seriously, and we'll continue to do so. I think, you know, I'm getting toward the end here. I think they're blinking the lights back there in the hallway. So I wanted to talk just very, very briefly about TPP and TTIP. But I'd like to maybe first of all refer you to some comments that Ambassador Froman made in an essay basically in Foreign Affairs. And he talked about the need for Trade Promotion Authority to persuade, he said, other countries to put their best offers on the table in these trade talks. And so I think, you know, we all have different opinions about how this is going as far as TPA and all these other things, but I just noticed just in the last hour that Labor has come out and basically said they will not support TPA at this point in time. So I don't know if this is directly as a result of what happened yesterday, but we don't need to make it any harder for us to try to conclude these negotiations because basically the clock is ticking. I think, but his broader point, I think, in this essay was that given the current constraints basically on fiscal and monetary policies, there is no better source of growth, and this is what I talked about earlier, than trade. That's the thing, that's the locomotive for this whole industry, for our economy. And he says as tensions rise in Asia and on the peripheries in Europe, the strategic merits of TPP and TTIP become even more clear. And at the same time, he said, Washington faces unprecedented constraints in crafting trade policy. And I think this is something we all know that do a lot of traveling and are involved, but he said the United States is no longer as dominant in the dominant position in the global economy as it was at the end of World War II. I think we all know that. And it said it's key for the United States to build coalitions willing to work towards consensus positions. And I think this is one of the things that we're trying to do in the MEF. We're not the U.S. government, but we really see trying to build consensus positions and all these things is very, very, very important. You know, recently I was just in Europe 10 days ago. I was over there with Thad and a lot of the exporters. There was a major show in Paris, that's the L show. And I think when we look at Europe, we recognize our government and the European Union, the EU, they've had 7 sets of negotiations. And I think we all agree, and I think we all aspire to what we call a 21st century agreement, a single undertaking. We want it by single undertaking, we don't want to have it split up. So we do a certain portion here, another portion there. We do it all at once. We want it to be comprehensive to cover all commodities. We want market access, because if there's any areas we need with market access, it would be Europe. So market access is a real key thing. And I think we also looked at science-based and rules-based trade as the cornerstone of any agreement going forward. So that's a big bite, and it's a big bite for the European. But I think Thad noticed this right away, and he spent a lot of time dealing with the Europeans, that even he was surprised at how very vocal the opposition is in Europe to TPP, to TTIP today. They're very organized. I think there's over 100 disinterest groups, if you will, that are working against this. Whether it's in Spain, whether it's in Brussels or London or wherever you are, there's concerns about our, quote, chlorinated chicken, there's concerns about our beef, there's concerns about everything. There's concerns, and these NGOs, these disinterest groups, are very organized, they're very well funded, and they're very well against this. And I think the observation is this has really taken the EU and the government in the EU by surprise. And I think that when we look back at this, the EU about 4 or 5 years ago, they had a lot of problems with Greece and with Portugal and with Spain. They're still having these problems. There's a lot of issues going on there in Europe, but they actually probably need this more than we do. So, I would hope that the EU government would start coming out and starting to address some of this, because it's going to make it even more difficult when everybody in the EU seems to be against this. So I think we need a whole new rhetoric when it comes to TTIP, and in some ways, I see this as a higher hill, a steeper hill to climb than even what we're dealing with in TPP. I think with TPP, I feel very, very good about where we are as far as the fact that it's only been going on 4 years. If you look at some of the other rounds that have gone on, Japan's only been in this just a little bit more of a year than a year. I guess when we look at TPP, of course, it represents tremendous possibilities for our industry, for pork, for beef, etc. So we do hope that we can come together and hopefully they can come to some kind of an agreement on this very, very soon. I think when we start looking at this, I'm always interested in kind of history in these areas, but this is a major agreement for the United States. But when you take a look at what this means in Japan, and if you take a look at their chief negotiator, Amadi, a lot of the people in the government, of course, know his name by now and know it very, very well. But Amadi is working for Abe, and Abe is trying to effect this major change in Japan by reforming, if you will, a lot of things in Japan in order to make Japan more competitive. And it kind of made me think about a gentleman who was an American who spent a lot of time there named General MacArthur. And probably the biggest land reform that was ever conducted in Japan was done by MacArthur back in 1946 through 1952. And what he did was he broke up all these major, very rich landholders. Almost the farmers back then before that were almost like serfs, if you will, working in Japan. And they came up with all these little plots. And so when the soldiers came back from the war, they were given these plots. And of course, these same soldiers, very conservative, they ended up being the backbone of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, and they all became farmers. So this group that was in power, they could rely on the farmers' vote, very conservative, and all these other kinds of things. And this cozy relationship served Japan very well for basically 50 years. So now Abe, who gets up and says, okay, now I want to change this, he's trying to maneuver as best he can to try to change and reform Japanese agriculture. But in Japanese agriculture, you've had the rise of the Norin Chukin Bank. It's one of the biggest banks in the world. There's the Japanese pension system involves these people. It's the largest in the world. And so there's all these different things now that he's basically saying we have to change. So for us, yep, our interest is getting that duty eradicated for beef, for pork, obviously getting it having as much access as possible for Japan. The negotiator is also responsible for the revitalization of Japan's rural area. So he's kind of between a rock and a hard spot. He's got to work with the United States, but he's also supposed to be revitalizing Japan's rural areas. And so Amadi, I don't think he sleeps at night. But the point is, what we're doing in Japan through TPP, it's a monumental shift sociologically, politically, in every facet of the society there, basically, that you can think of. So I really applaud the effort our negotiators are making. I'm reminded of the fact that Japan has never concluded an EPA or an FTA where they've gone to zero. So just like we're saying we have to do zero, we've had all this success. Japanese have said we've never done zero. And that whole basis for their agriculture is based on protectionism. But I am very encouraged. When we were just in Paris, we also went to the CL show, and we saw a booth by the Japanese. And I remember for years living there and talking about, instead of protection, how about promotion? And so what we're finally seeing is the Japanese promoting their beef internationally. And hopefully, I hope they're very, very successful, because as they can see the fruit of trade in agriculture, I think obviously one hand washes the other. It should hopefully help them open their markets, and hopefully we can all come to some mutual satisfaction, because for us, it's a $4 billion market right now, and it's growing. So with that, I would just like to say thank you very much. I probably took too much time, but nonetheless, I do appreciate it. And again, I really encourage all of you to take your time, meet with people, meet with our directors. We look very much to meeting with you, to discussing anything you have on your minds, and thank you very much. Thank you.